We're diving into a single short note from a blog called kianmeng.org, Musings of an Old Software Plumber.
Right.
And we're going to try and extract the whole intellectual framework behind it. We are not just here for gardening tips.
No, not at all.
We're here to understand the mind.
Exactly. Our mission for you today is really a two-part investigation. We're starting with the ultra-specific. So analyzing the practical insights on a flower called the Crested Celosia.
Okay.
But the real deep dive, I think, is using that one hyper-specific note to map out the vast intellectual dedication and really the methodical framework of the person who wrote it.
That's right. The focus plant is Crested Celosia, which is also known as coxcomb. And the source we're looking at is labeled Notes on Gardening, Part 771.
Which is just a wow.
Yeah, that number alone tells you almost everything you need to know about the author's commitment.
Right. It really does. We're treating a brief observation about an ornamental plant, like an instruction manual, a manual for maximizing intellectual output. So let's start at the beginning, because the author sets up this wonderful paradox almost immediately.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack this opening. It's unusual. The author hits us with a pretty genuine critique right up front. They admit they have never been a particularly big fan of Celosia.
Right out of the gate.
Especially the crested or coxcomb variety.
And it's such an important detail because it sets the entire tone. They explicitly state their aesthetic reservations about the appearance of the flat, fan-shaped flowers. This isn't just a casual.
I don't like it.
Exactly. It's a formal critique of the plant's structure. It's an intellectual rejection of its form.
Which, of course, raises the question, if you don't like the look of the flower, why on earth are you growing it? And that's where the commitment to the process becomes the hook.
It does. It reveals that gardening, for this author, is not really a decorative pursuit. Despite these reservations, they still sow various seeds for the sheer joy of gardening. I mean, that's a commitment to the experiment itself.
The experiment, not the outcome.
Precisely. The author's explicit rule is to ensure no pot stays empty for long. So the value is in the consistent activity and the observation, not the final subjective beauty of it.
That is such a critical distinction. It's the constant engagement with the physical world that matters. You see this kind of discipline in coding, you know? The process of debugging and iterating is often more satisfying than the finished product.
Absolutely. The driving force is the engagement, not the result. And yet, even within this very objective, very experimental framework, they still manage to find a point of aesthetic appreciation.
They did. Despite the structural issues they have with the flower's form, they find the coloration to be quite striking. And they specifically call out the pinkish-white variation as beautiful.
So the form is rejected, but the hue is celebrated. This isn't just a gardener who changed their mind. This is a scientist who logged an unexpected positive finding.
Right.
The detailed observation means they're actively looking for merit, even in a subject they were initially prejudiced against. They aren't just tolerating the plant, they're finding its specific, quantifiable virtues.
That sets the stage perfectly for the next shift in the note, because we leave behind these subjective critiques of beauty and move squarely into the plant's objective functional utility.
Yes.
This is where the celosia really transforms from a flower into, well, a piece of equipment.
And what's so insightful here is the connection they draw. If we connect this to the author's larger intellectual project, the core functional value of this plant is that it is an excellent specimen for evaluating different microclimates.
That is the ultimate so what for the celosia, isn't it? It's not decoration. It's a living, localized sensor for environmental conditions.
It is.
And for you, the listener, if you don't spend all your time in the garden, a microclimate is basically a tiny, highly localized climate zone. It could be the specific patch of soil in your yard that gets more sun because of a reflecting wall, or
the pot on the windy balcony versus the shady windowsill.
Exactly.
They're running tiny, controlled experiments all across their outdoor space. They are treating the celosia's growth, its color density, its overall vigor, as measurable outputs that are directly tied to the variables of its location.
Like, is the color paler in this spot because there's less direct light? Is the stalk weaker here due to constant wind exposure?
Yes. This is classic systems testing translated directly into botany.
The note also gives us context on ideal growth versus the author's reality. The source material explains that the visual appeal, the kind of look you might see in a magazine, is best when the plant is grown in abundance.
That sea of flowers effect.
Right, or in a cluster, creating that beautiful sea of flowers.
That's the theoretical optimum. But achieving that density is complicated by the author's own constraints. They acknowledge the contrast between this ideal outcome and their own methodology,
A low-maintenance gardening style.
which makes getting that dense clustered effect in pots a bit of a challenge.
I really appreciate that self-awareness. It acknowledges the constraints of the system being studied, in this case, their own gardening approach, and how those limitations impact the data.
It's an admission that the optimal result might be sacrificed for the sake of long-term sustainability for the study itself. If they can't sustain the intense work of high-density planting, then the data just won't be consistent over time.
And they have a perfect natural control group to measure against. They use a specific anecdote to illustrate what peak, unconstrained performance looks like.
The giant celosia.
Yes, the giant celosia that once grew effortlessly on its own in my front yard.
That's their benchmark. That unsolicited massive growth under optimal, though undocumented circumstances is the goalpost. It's what they measure their meticulous potted experiments against.
They know what the celosia can do. And now they are using their smaller test cases to try and reverse engineer why that uncontrolled one was so successful.
It gives them a tangible metric. Their goal isn't just to keep the plant alive, but to move their current result closer to that giant celosia outcome by adjusting variables, soil mix, watering schedule, placement, all of it.
Okay, that gives us the full picture of the plant then. An initial aesthetic rejection, its conversion into a microclimate sensor, and an established, uncontrolled benchmark for success. But now we have to pull the lens back and talk about the person writing all this, because the garden note is really just the tip of the iceberg.
This is where we get to use the surrounding source material, the blog metadata, the project list, to understand the intellectual engine that's driving this documentation habit.
And here's where it connects perfectly to that idea of process. This person who so meticulously documents the success and failure of a pinkish-white flower identifies themselves as an old software plumber.
An old software plumber. I love that.
Who spends their time, quote, night-long tinkering with free Libre and open source software, LLS.
So that identity is key. They aren't a garden center owner. They are a systems architect. And when they refer to floss-free Libre and open source software, they're not just talking about coding projects. They were stating an ideological preference for open knowledge, for transparency.
And that philosophy translates directly to the scale and rigor of their documentation. We mentioned it earlier, this is Notes on Gardening, part 771. That single number it's just astonishing.
It is.
That sheer volume of dedications, 771 documented observations on one topic, shows a long-term, almost institutional commitment to observation. We can see archived posts that stretch back over a decade.
In the programming world, 771 entries would be the equivalent of thousands of meticulously logged, version-controlled changes, or commits. It quantifies not just their curiosity, but their sheer discipline. Everything is tracked, everything is categorized and made accessible.
And this rigor is not restricted to horticulture, not by a long shot. The list of projects the author tracks and documents is vast and technical. They have entire categories dedicated to specific, complex programming languages under Notes on Programming.
We see Elixir Erlang, Python, Haskell, Go, and Rust.
A pretty serious list.
A very serious list. And what's fascinating is which languages they focus on. Languages like Haskell and Elixir are functional programming languages. For the non-technical listener, you just need to know these aren't just tools. They represent a mindset.
How so?
Well, they demand precision, mathematical rigor, and thinking in terms of pure functions, where specific inputs will always produce predictable outputs. No side effects.
So, the same mindset that rigorously demands predictable outputs in code
is the same mindset that's testing microclimate variables to achieve a predictable output in a celosia pot.
Wow. Okay, that clicks.
Absolutely. The intellectual link is that both gardening and functional programming are treated as closed systems. Systems where inputs must be perfectly measured and documented to achieve a desired, consistent outcome. You just move from the logic of a Haskell function to the logic of soil drainage.
And then, outside of pure code, their curiosity just explodes. It goes into self-optimization, personal development. They have Notes on Science hobby, where they're tracking things like AI, fish keeping, photography, and typesetting.
Yes, and if we look at their personal life, the system-level approach continues. They document their progress on meditation, dieting, which has its own Part 112 noted in the archives.
Part 112 on dieting. That's incredible.
Home improvement and guitar.
It shows that they treat their own metabolism, their home, their musical skill as systems to be studied, to be documented and incrementally improved, just like their code and their celosia.
It removes emotion from the process, doesn't it? Success is measured by consistent data entry. not by how they feel about the diet or the plant on any given day. The celosia is a proxy for how this author lives their entire life. Everything is a system awaiting optimization through detailed observation.
So what does this accumulation of data tell us about the underlying values here? We can connect the author's explicit support list directly back to their identity as a software plumber who is committed to open knowledge.
You can. They publicly list support for organizations that are foundational to digital rights and information freedom. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, or EFF,
The Free Software Foundation, FSF?
the Tor Project, and Wikipedia.
That confirms the mission, then. They don't just write open source code, they actively support the infrastructure that ensures knowledge, whether it's source code or a critical assessment of a pinkish-white flower, remains free and accessible to the public. It's a unified worldview.
It is. The initial gardening note we analyzed is simply the most recent entry in a lifelong, self-directed encyclopedia. The author is less concerned with having the perfect flower,
And far more concerned with understanding it.
understanding the perfect, replicable, and documented conditions needed to achieve it.
That brings us to our final synthesis. We started with a small, fan-shaped flower the author explicitly disliked, and through a deep dive into the source metadata, we ended up charting the systematic, prolific, intellectual dedication of a software engineer.
The summary here is that the Crested Celosia serve two perfect functions. First, as a tiny aesthetic project, and second, as a living sensor for their garden's microclimates. But the profound takeaway, I think, is the disciplined methodology of the person observing it.
Right. The true value of the celosia wasn't its look, but its ability to serve as a tiny test case for a larger theory. The study of variable inputs versus measurable outputs.
It's a perfect analogy.
A powerful analogy for how this author approaches every complex subject, from functional programming to personal health. If you can track a plant, you can track anything.
Knowledge, regardless of the domain, is seen through this lens of detailed, consistent documentation. Every new piece of information is simply the next part number in a massive interconnected project log.
So we'll leave you with this final provocative thought. Look at your own work, or maybe your own hobbies. What seemingly small observation in your daily life, whether it's optimizing a client server, tracking your morning routine, or learning a new skill, could you start documenting into part 771 of your own deep dive?
Because the smallest, most rigorous note today might just be the start of your own epic intellectual system tomorrow.